The brokenness of humanity is the cause of hurt, destruction, and death, as we discussed yesterday in the bad news. Our sin breaks us and drags all of creation into its wake. Of course, the consequences of our sin are not just limited to this world. By choosing sin, our way, over the path of righteousness, we are committing ourselves to separation from God. Our sin, our choice to sin, is a choice to be separate from God. Of course, we were created to be in relationship with Him, so the ultimate reality of our separation from Him is a hellish state of being. If our core longing of our heart cannot be fulfilled, then we would be bound to an experience that is nothing short of hellish. That's why, when we read in Matthew chapter 1 that an angel promised Mary her child would save his people from their sins, we know that good news has arrived. Jesus, whose name means God will save, came to save us from our sin. This is twofold. Ultimately, his death would cover the consequence of our sin, but just as importantly, Jesus would make clear a way of being that would provide us a path free of sin. By his living, Jesus unfolds what it looks like to live a life that is not bound by sin. He isn't selfish. He isn't filled with hate. He doesn't harm the people around him by his thoughts, words, or actions. His entire being is committed to the kind of life that God created humanity for in the first place. A life of love for one another, a life of supporting one another, a life of good service in which every person pursues the success of their fellow image bearer. Genesis chapter 6 says, and the bleak history of humanity left to its own devices shows, every inclination of man was only evil always. Jesus is the exact opposite. His life and the fruits of his life are explicitly good at all times. Jesus came, John tells us, to shine as a light in the darkness. His actions are not just actions to save us from our past sin. They're to show us a clear path of living righteously. When we examine the life of Jesus, we aren't supposed to only look towards his death and resurrection as a get-out-of-jail-free card. We're to see his every action, every word, every relationship as a clear marker of what it really means to live the way God wants us to live. And he does it. The good news of the life of Jesus is that we can, with Jesus as our guide, grow closer each day to who God wants us to be. Yesterday, we talked about the wide and narrow paths. It's easier to take the wide path because that's what so many people in our world do. It's modeled to us in 1,000 different ways each and every day. But Jesus has shown us a far better path. And if we are willing to accept his death for the forgiveness of our past sins, for salvation from the consequence of those sins, we should also be prepared to look at his life to be, as Psalm 119 would tell us, a lamp to our feet and a light upon our path. I love you, and I pray today that you would walk the narrow path, the narrow but well-lit path of Jesus today.